afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Roger asked me to look at rural-urban tensions, and I will do that through consideration of scarcity and its physical and economic implications. But there we go, water scarcity, agriculture, the guilty party or the residual user. How bad are we at playing with water? Last week, the Chennai Metropolitan Water Supply and Sewerage Board invited bids for 100 megalitre per day reverse osmosis plant. This is not a lot of desalination capacity compared with that of Abu Dhabi or Dubai. But clearly, coastal cities in subtropical peninsular India are thirsty. In this decade, the fields of the Deccan Plateau behind Chennai have also been dry. The agricultural GDP has fallen dramatically, with farmer suicides perhaps the ultimate manifestation of water scarcity. Good monsoons in 2006 and 2007 saw some recovery, and also a shift in production away from staple foods, food crops to a more diverse set of plant crops. These are not new stresses, but pressure to desalinate in other coastal cities is building, from London to Perth. Should we take this as a sign of exhaustion, let alone scarcity? No doubt getting urban municipal utilities to supply more efficiently and encouraging urban populations to manage their demand will need further effort. But the straightforward matching of supply and demand in densely populated areas is not getting easier or cheaper. What can agriculture do? On the one hand, this predominantly urban world wants cheap, high-quality food, but it also wants a say in how it's produced. As a result, the debate can become very polarized. Irrigation is bad, conservation agriculture good. Smallholder production is the way to go, down with commercial agribusiness, and so on. In practice, there is a constant adjustment as the styles of agricultural systems respond to changing markets. I suspect feeding 9 billion will need all styles of production to be effective. Ari has given us a brief background to this overall allocation to agriculture, but just to highlight some points on figures, if we want to examine how significant the water variable is in agricultural production. Well, the good news ought to be that only 10% of withdrawals from our freshwater systems are withdrawn for the production of potable water, 20% for industrial use, and the rest withdrawn by irrigated agriculture, which will provide, as Ari pointed out, approximately 40% of global agricultural production, and significantly 60% of cereal production. Together with the rather more volatile production for rain-fed agriculture, this is just about enough to satisfy demands for cereals and leave a small carryover to be put into store. Meeting future demands from intensification or expansion should cause more concern, since the physical and political limits to increase production are all too evident. Certainly in terms of water use, irrigated agriculture is guilty as charged. Even though it's looking for high volumes of low-quality water, it has managed to degrade some of the best quality surface and groundwater without, it can be argued, ever having to account for its impact in economic, social, and environmental terms. But it also has to be appreciated that irrigation of staple crops occurs when the inherent volatility in rainfed production becomes intolerable, where irrigation offers the chance to reduce plant stress, boost yields, and increase cropping intensities. Whether or not the investment in irrigated production is performed and results in the expected economic benefits is another question. But before evaluating the overall performance of irrigation, there are some myths of irrigation potential and water scarcity that need some attention. Perhaps denoting the upper limit of land and water availability as irrigation potential has been the original sin. Here the contrast between sub-Saharan Africa and Asia is always given to illustrate unrealized potential. For politicians, expanding irrigated agriculture may seem an obvious choice when rainfed production does not deliver. In fact, in the climatic zones where irrigated production does give specific comparative advantage, land and water tend to be constrained. How many more Canara sugars can the white Nile take down the stream of the Suez? On the other hand, claims that somehow improved rainfed production through conservation agriculture would obviate the need for more withdrawals by irrigation need to be examined carefully. Where conservation agriculture has been taken to scale to serve commodity markets, the conditions of land tenure, mechanization, road and energy infrastructure have been specific, as in the case of Brazil. These conditions do not necessarily obtain everywhere. In the case of smallholder rainfed production, even if the inputs can be improved through raise crop yields, the production risk is still there. Rain and growth. Plant breeding has certainly enhanced the natural adaptation to climatic conditions, but the fundamental metabolic pathways in plants determine a fixed relationship between biomass and respiration. This is essentially non-negotiable, so more cultivated biomass will always need more water. But water is just one of many variables that determine the final yield. In farm budgets, water usually figures very low down in the league table of input costs. Labour, seed, fertiliser, pesticides, mechanisation inputs generally eclipse water service charges, if they happen to decline. However, make water scarce, and farmers with choice will generally go for maximising cash per drop, not necessarily yield or crop per crop. While groundwater table decline may be taken as the first symptom of water scarcity, plots of apparent groundwater decline need to be interpreted carefully before making statements about depletion of groundwater reserves. Equally, apart from some educated guesses as to how much irrigated area is supplied by groundwater, it is not possible to quantify the role of groundwater services in agricultural production with any precision. In most cases, government reporting of irrigated areas does not capture the source of water, or indeed the scope of commercial irrigation practices, which are sometimes the main groundwater user. And in Asia, conjunctive use of groundwater development is tended to occur in spite of prevailing hydraulic administrations. It tends to be informal, opportunistic, but essentially unregulated and uncounted. And although access to groundwater has been a source of economic liberation, intensive use is not without its risks. As deeper circulation is exploited, mobilization of arsenic and chloride becomes apparent, and potable supplies can be there. No wonder there are calls for irrigated agriculture to somehow improve its efficiency and free up water for other uses with high economic returns. However, it is a general observation that whenever farmers do make irrigation efficiency gains through adoption of new technology, the savings go right back into expanded irrigation areas. It is the expectation that agriculture can free up some of its 70% allocation through efficiency gains simply a delusion. Another way to look at this issue of allocation is to observe that agriculture is the residual user of water. It will use whatever is left over and lies around unclaimed. With unreliable supplies in many large gravity schemes in southern and eastern Asia, farmers are very adept at scavenging water wherever they can, from main canals to drainage ditches, or by simply mopping up leakage. As Tushar Shah would argue, if these are the most trodden paths to access water for on-demand, just-in-time service, why not abandon command and control and use canal irrigation as a groundwater recharge delivery system? Back to the macro view. The recent spike in commodity prices provoked a lot of optimism that developing countries would be able to take advantage of higher prices as new equilibriums were established and new producers entered global markets. However, macroeconomists tend to underplay the supply problems, generally expecting agricultural systems to respond to higher prices over subsequent growing seasons. And they have generally been correct in the past. But clearly, mid-2008 was an extreme event, fueled, as Alan has pointed out to us, by a number of physical and market factors that happened to coincide. In this respect, we should bear in mind that some key irrigated production systems in Asia and Australia are operating at their limits, the Indus and Murray-Darling basins are two cases in point. In addition, as we've seen with irrigation management transfer, institutional rigidity persists when public operation maintenance interests are entrenched. The regional contrasts in this slide are significant. While developing countries were able to boost production over 2000 levels in 2008, the largest positive change in 2008, in fact, appears to have occurred in Europe. So food production is still a problem for those in most need. It can be compounded by food policy. Food import surges do affect the formation of domestic producer prices and can do irreparable harm to local markets, while export bans can drive global prices up rapidly. The low-income food deficit countries and the net food imported deficit countries are clusters of particular concern. Many have seen agricultural terms of trade decline rapidly, and commercial food import bills rise dramatically. The commercial food bill for Africa is forecast to rise from some $40 billion in 2007 to $50 billion in 2008. Could the need for these import bills have been avoided? Generally, water supply utilities are quite expert at sweating the assets, squeezing the last bit of a performance out of aging storage structures, pumps and pipes before replacing them. But assuming irrigation will always be necessary, it's disturbing to observe how low cropping intensities can get in major irrigation schemes. One has to be careful in interpreting data and making mechanical evaluations, but from recent appraisals of large schemes, cropping intensities between 1 and 1.5 in China and India are common. They're even lower in Pakistan. A mix of water scarcity, low management capacity, and worn-out infrastructure can explain some of the intensities, or they may indicate that a lot of assets were simply not being sweated. Rehabilitation and modernisation into changing markets for irrigated production offer opportunities for raising economic performance of irrigation, but the operational limits of many schemes and their original purpose when designed and built need to be fully appreciated before passing judgment. The legacy of irrigated production from the 20th century notwithstanding, if further investment into irrigated production is to be justified, will it be able to serve the demands of urbanising populations? In many cases, the irrigated subsectors are very poorly adjusted to domestic, let alone regional and international markets in irrigated crops. If we compare this current distribution of population across Africa with the density of irrigated agriculture, agricultural intensification is not following the centres of demand. For instance, there is hardly any large-scale commercial irrigation in Nigeria to feed the growing cities in the north, and yet the 90,000 hectares of equipped federal schemes are only seeing crop production on some 30,000 hectares. Informal groundwater-enabled farmer development has been able to pick up some of the slack, but not enough to cater for the quantity and quality of demand from urban consumers. Nigeria has to import approximately half its requirements in rice. By contrast, Swaziland, which has a very advanced commercial irrigation subsector based on sugar and citrus, it has no internal means to buffer chronic failure in the rain-fed maize crop, and has a very light obligation to maintain and close down the scheme to Mozambique. The paths of development do not necessarily follow neat lines of technical comparative advantage, or if they do, there is no guarantee that the beneficiaries will be those most in need. How do these observations on the water variable in agriculture impact policy? The experience of India with employment guarantee schemes and rural loan forgiveness points to the enduring political significance of rural populations. The fate of highly mobile migrant labour in China in times of economic downturn are now key concerns for policymakers. The response to incentives and their interests for getting in and out of agriculture are not just matters for academic research, and keeping rural spaces open for return may be just as important as improving urban infrastructure. Certainly, the dynamic irrigation migration patterns observed in India in relation to the essentially unregulated and private groundwater economy, what Tushar Shah would call atomistic irrigation, illustrate the mobility of labour and livelihoods in response to water scarcity. But the sheer intensity of urban demand in Gujarat has pulled water out of agriculture. What were once designed as irrigation conveyance canals out of the Narmada system now service municipal water supply. These canals can be seen from space, as in this overview of Ahmedabad in Gujarat. And similar trends can be observed in North China, and no doubt we will see more of this. So under conditions of scarcity, is there a case for rethinking basic allocation before assuming efficiency gains in agriculture are the only policy response? If it is the case that cities and possibly some hydropower schemes are held hostage by agriculture, what tests of beneficial use should apply? Are there mutually acceptable methods to allow competing claims to be evaluated? And are our regulatory institutions capable of doing this? Coastal cities, such as Maputo, on this slide here, are having to cope with scarcity of water quantity and quality. In other cases, agricultural production and wetland biodiversity could be helped by more imaginative release rules. Water allocation procedures under more variable climates and the need for more effective regulation in the interest of public health are things that agriculture need to consider before rural livelihoods are impacted. At least let it be a gentle transition and not a brutal one. To a certain extent, it is always surprising that crops are produced in spite of agriculture policy, in spite of ministries of agriculture, in spite of irrigation community authorities. To reiterate Tushar Shah's point, if atomistic irrigation is the most trodden path to irrigation supply, should public operators of large irrigation schemes just become top-up operators to keep leaky canals active so that farmers can pump on demand? Clearly, water user institutions and water regulators would need to look at themselves very differently from their present configurations. In conclusion, if agriculture has had any success, it has been in mopping up all the unclaimed water it can get its hands on. Recapturing or reallocating water away from agriculture may be possible in some circumstances, or merely brutal in others. Institutional rigidity prevails, and irrigation as a form of political patronage is sometimes a daily reality. Whereas irrigation as a form of agricultural intensification finally adjusted to market pull in specific crops is sometimes a little hard to find. The feeding of the 9 billion will need a little more innovation and a little more flexibility. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.